Hello boys and girls, welcome back to another episode of Pencil and Tools, and as promised in this video we're going to do a couple of tests before we go to the actual pour. At the end of this video I did a complete summary of all the key learnings that I think you should know before you start doing this as a DIY project in your own house. So please stick around. First off, let's talk about mixing. What you'll need is a clean bucket, something reliable to measure some water, and the first thing that you're going to do is pour in the water in the bucket. That's the first sequence. Then you're going to add the powder, and once the powder has been added, then you're going to mix it. Right after the initial mix, it's really important to use a trowel to clean off the edges and the bottom of your bucket, so that all these hard pieces can be dissolved in your second pass with the mixer. Once the edges have been cleaned off, I use the mixer for another 2 to 3 minutes or until I have a very consistent mass. For this first batch I've set the mixer to the maximum speed, but as you can see this is not the best option as it traps a lot of air. Once it has cured for another 2 to 3 minutes, it's time to start pouring and see how this works. Immediately I could see that there was still a lot of air trapped in it and it wasn't really flowing the way I wanted to. So in order to get these air bubbles out of there and see if this spike roller really does a good job, I decided to give it a try on only half of this batch and see the results afterwards. You can clearly see that the area that I've worked on with this spike roller has a texture to it, whereas the other end looks a lot more smooth. As for the amount of air bubbles, I didn't really see a big difference between both sides. It kind of looks as if the air bubbles on the spike roller side are distributed a little bit better, but they're still there, so there wasn't much of a difference. So now that we've cleared that up, let's prepare for the second layer of self-leveling concrete. And as with any concrete product, this isn't waterproof and actually highly absorbent, so we need to treat this one with another layer of primer. As with the initial priming of the floor, once again I'm making sure that I do enough passes of the priming so that I can do a water test that has a positive result before continuing with the second layer. Now for the second batch I've tried to add a little bit more water and also mixing it on a lower speed, and immediately I could tell that there was a lot less air trapped into the mixture. Also the flowing was a lot better, so with this one I was a lot more pleased than with the first batch. I have only added 2.5% of additional water, so if you want to try it then I recommend you do it in small increments. One important side note on adding extra water is that yes, you're increasing the overall workability of your product. Bear in mind though that going away from the recommended amount of water does decrease the strength of your final product. And just for shits and giggles, I thought I'd try to use the roller once again, complete surface, and see what the result is when the material is flowing a little bit better. One thing I did notice is that once the roller is going through the mixture, the spikes are actually pulling up the material and dropping it back off, and this kind of gives it a second flow, making sure that all the edges and then the overlaps are being blended in nicely. Overall I have to say that with the second pass I'm pretty happy with the results. There's not much air trapped in it and it looks silky smooth. Was easy to work with, and I'm dying to see how it looks when it dried up. Now here you can see a side-by-side comparison. This is the first batch and all the air bubbles that are trapped in it. This is the second batch with 100 millimeters of extra water and there's hardly any air bubbles left. And of course, before we can continue, we have to add another layer of primer. Since the primer needs some time to dry up, it's a good moment to install this piece of insulation on the walls. Now the saga says that this insulation prevents the floor from cracking once you're pouring a complete slab of self-leveling concrete. The idea behind it is that you're forming a barrier between the slab of concrete and the walls, and this gives the concrete the opportunity to expand and to contract depending on the weather and the temperature without forming any cracks. To install this, I'm just using some small steel nails, and I'm trying to make sure that the insulation layer is as close to the bottom as possible so that none of the self-leveling compound can go underneath. In this next test, I'm going to try and mix two bags at the same time, see if this is still workable and if it actually saves me time or creates more problems down the road. Now the first thing that I noticed that there's a lot more chunks in there, and it becomes a lot more difficult to scrape it away with a trowel because the whole mixture is a lot deeper. I have to say though that transporting a bucket with only one bag inside is a lot easier. As for the actual pouring, I have to admit that having this much compound ready, it put a little bit of stress on me since you only have limited amount of time to install all the stuff before it starts to harden out. So my preference goes to one bag per batch. Once again giving it a pass with the spike roller, and as you can see it really helps to even out the complete surface.
There you go, pretty as a picture.
Before I apply a new layer of primer, I make sure that this slab is completely dried up. This will increase the drying speed. This gives me plenty of time to reinstall my laser and check all the ground levels to see at which spots I can do some more tests. In this next test, I'm gonna try out how well this stuff works with fiberglass reinforcement. I have a crack anyway, and I do mean in the concrete, so I might as well give it a try and see how well it does. This is a sheet of non-sticking fiberglass, and when I was working my way over it, I did notice that it had the tendency to start floating, so I constantly had to push it back down with the spike roller. Here once again you can clearly see the effect of the spike roller. You see the boundary in the middle, and as I'm going over it, it kind of disappears, so it serves as a way to blend in the two batches of self-leveling concrete. After everything has dried up, you can clearly see that certain patches of the glass fiber have come to the surface. So you can work with it, but I would recommend that you would do it in separate layers so that with the first layer you're trapping it, and then with the next layer you're covering everything up. In the back part of my garage I still had some height to fill in, and this was an ideal opportunity to see how well it works if I pour this on a relatively fresh layer of self-leveling compound. And as you will see, on the right side, which had the previous layer, it wasn't sealed properly, and because I didn't do an absorbency test, I kind of forgot about it. But you see that there's a lot of air bubbles escaping, and yeah, this is gonna backfire. If your underground is not sealed properly, then this will be the result, and it doesn't matter if you use the spike roller intensively, which I did. As long as there's air trapped in the lower layer that can rise up, then this is the effect that you will get. And you know, since the spike roller didn't help anymore, the only sensible thing to do for me was to, well, cry myself to sleep and wait for the result. After a long night of crying, I was actually quite happy that this happened during my first trials and not in the final layer. Time to man up and move on. Another thing that I noticed is that at the back end of my garage, I start to get these white spots on my floor. After a quick research, I learned that this has something to do with poor ventilation. If there isn't enough air circulation, then the evaporated water will condensate back onto the floor, and the salts from the water will crystallize as a fine powder on top. So This also shuts down the drying process and leave you with these white spots that you can easily scratch off. Luckily, I still had one final testing layer to do, so I could see if the white spots had any influence on the process. And as you can see, they dry up really fast. Most likely what happened is that as I was scratching away the white powder, I was also scratching away the layer of primer on top, and the end result is that this is gonna just absorb like a sponge. Also, I can imagine that in the final layer, having this type of powder on top is not beneficial for finishing it with a clear coat. And it seems that the whole back area has this kind of white shine on top of it, so the only proper solution is to provide enough ventilation. I'm pretty much done testing now, so it's time to summarize the key learnings here and see what we can take along into the next pour. Okay, so first off is the priming. Priming is key as it helps you stabilize the floor. This means any dust particles can be attached, and it will also ensure that the floor is becoming less absorbent. This means you will have more time to work with the self-leveling concrete as it's drying slower. Always make sure that you do the absorbency test to ensure that the floor is properly sealed, and you can apply this with either a roller, a brush, or as I used, a spray gun. Second up is the mixing process. Always start with a clean bucket, then add your water, then add your powder, give it a thorough mix of about 2 minutes, use a trowel to scrape the edges and the bottom, then mix it again for another 2 to 3 minutes, let it rest, and then you're good to start pouring. Keep in mind the manufacturer's recommended amount of mixing speed, as an increase of mixing speed will also increase the amount of air trapped into your mixture. Now let's talk water ratio. I would always start to follow the manufacturer's recommendations regarding the amount of water needed for one bag. In your second batch, you can add another 2% and see how that works. This will increase the flow and decrease the amount of air bubbles that are being trapped into the mixture. Bear in mind though, adding extra water will also decrease the strength of your final product. Fourth up the list is the spiked roller. You can see a lot of information on the internet saying that this is about degassing. I find it not to be true. For me, it's more about increasing the product flow, being able to blend in 2 batches of product, and I highly recommend that you purchase this if you want to try out using a self-leveling compound. I'll leave a link down in the description just so that you can know what type of product that I've used. There's many different brands out there. I think they're all fine as long as they have the small spikes on the roller. Number 5 is the layer of insulation between the walls and your slab of self-leveling concrete. This is supposed to work as a barrier to prevent any cracking once the complete surface is drying out. It also prevents moisture from being absorbed by the walls, and yeah, it's dirt cheap, so you might as well install it. Last but not least is to provide enough ventilation. If you don't have good ventilation, then there will be a poor transportation of the water that evaporates from the mixture. You will have condensation back onto the mixture, you'll get this white salty powder, and this is of course bad for finishing your floor off with a clear coat or any other type of finishing. If you want to see if these learnings have helped me in the final layer, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.